The views and opinions expressed on today's show are solely those of the individuals speaking and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the American Solidarity Party. The official party platform can be found under the About Us page on the American Solidarity Party website, solidarity-party.org. You're listening to The Pelican Brief, the official podcast of the American Solidarity Party, a show dedicated to promoting the common good on common ground through common sense. I'm your host, Bill Fleming. Today we have a special edition of The Pelican Brief that is being published outside of our regular schedule. After watching the first debate between Vice President Biden and President Trump last night, we knew we would be remiss if we did not have Brian Carroll on today to discuss the debates and the presidency. Brian, thank you for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
So, can you share a little bit of your background for any of our listeners who may be unfamiliar with you?
I am a recently retired school teacher. Mostly I taught history, taught a few other things. Mostly I taught California. I did teach 9 years on a mission station in Colombia, South America. I taught English one summer in China. But most of my career was teaching history, and most of that was at the junior high level. I've been married for 47 years, and my wife and I have 5 adult children and 14 grandchildren. I have been involved in political kinds of activities. Going back 40 years, I was involved in a movement to get a public transportation system started in my city about 40 years ago. That's Visalia, California, Central California, south of Fresno. And then I was involved in an activity to discourage an abortionist to setting up a facility here in Visalia. That was about 30 years ago. So I've been involved in political kinds of things and involved in pro-life kinds of things. And so this was kind of a surprise to be the candidate this year, but it was also a logical next step in many of the things that I've done.
So, what do you see as being the top 3 issues facing our country today, and how would you address them as president?
Well, you don't get to choose what is most important because a lot of it gets forced on you. I mean, I would love to make abortion the most important issue, but right now the most pro-life issue we have is climate change. We are at a point where it's triage. We're having hurricanes like we've never had before. We're having wildfires like never before. We had the derecho in Iowa. We've had one thing after another, and it's not going to get better. Unless we address climate, this is the new normal. So that's number one. Number two, another one that, we have pushed social justice, racial justice under the rug for so long, and we've got to address it. There's just no other way around it. And then obviously I would still like to get to the issue of abortion. Well, you also asked what I would do about it. First of all, a president has to work with Congress. And on climate, there is a very good group of congressmen, the Climate Solutions Caucus. It's bipartisan. They call it a Noah's Ark because they have to go in 2 by 2, one Republican, one Democrat joining together. And they are going to have to take the lead. But as a president, it would be my task to support them every way I could. There might be some executive orders that I could put out. And I would be counting on a group of scientists to help me put those together. As far as racial justice, there's another caucus in Congress, the Problem Solvers Caucus, and I would be looking to them. A lot of what we're looking at in justice, especially racial justice, is going to be state and local, and so the federal government and the president can use the bully pulpit, certainly in a positive way. President Trump has used it in more of a negative way, but the president speaks out on issues like that and leads, but a lot of it has to take place at state and local levels. Uh, as far as abortion, I would like to see a personhood amendment. Uh, every human being from conception uh, should have uh, rights of personhood. A an unborn baby, if there's a situation where there's a question of, is the mother's life in danger, or is it a case where uh, abortion might be necessary? There ought to be in those decisions somebody representing the child's interest, and at the same time, while unborn children should have rights of personhood, I don't believe that corporations should have the same uh, protections, uh, Bill of Rights protections that natural humans do.
One thing that you didn't mention is healthcare. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump have made healthcare an important part of their agendas in very different ways. I know you have several grandchildren born in England and several born in Brazil. Can you discuss your family's experience with those systems and what we in America might be able to learn from them?
Yeah, and I have more of an idea of what happened in England than in Brazil. Uh, but I have three grandchildren born in England under the British system, UK system, and the bills were all paid. My daughter-in-law got a choice of maternity leaves. Uh, I don't remember all the conditions that went with them, but she chose 6 months, uh, and and that was paid. And I was very very pleased with the results of how the British system worked. There's no system that's without faults completely, uh, but every other country, every other industrialized country in the world has figured out how to do it. And I believe we can figure out how to do it. It has to be coordinated between president and Congress. There's going to be a lot of negotiations. Um, and so it's hard to tell what the details will come out looking like. But we need to make sure that everybody is covered. And I think that we can save enough money by eliminating a lot of the paperwork. Most doctors spend more time filling out paperwork for insurance companies than they do meeting with patients. Uh, if we go to a system where there's less question about who's paying for what, single payer means the doctor does it and says what he did, and the extra paperwork is eliminated. We can have our doctors actually doing medicine instead of paperwork. Uh, and there's a duplication of paperwork at every level under our current for-profit insurance. We need to correct that.
Given the recent death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the partisanship of the Supreme Court and what reforms you would like to see made to depoliticize the court.
Well, okay, we talk about partisanship on the courts, and there's always been partisanship on the courts. I mean, if you go back to the early case, Marbury versus Madison, President John Adams was sitting at his desk filling out judicial appointments. And at midnight, Jefferson's guy shows up to take over the office and lock the door, lock Adams out. And Adams, when he grabbed a bunch of papers, did not grab Marbury's commission. And so Marbury sued that the paper had been filled out. He should have got it. He should be a judge. And the Supreme Court, under John Marshall, realized that they could give Jefferson the small victory and at the same time claim the power of judicial review for the courts. So there's always been intrigue all the way through. And, this year, you could not have picked a more dramatic moment for Justice Ginsburg to pass away. And the momentum of things is going to carry it. There's no way that Trump could not nominate somebody. There's no way that the Democrats could not put up a real fight. So it's going to happen. There's nothing that I can say that's going to change that. And so the question is, are the Republicans able to rush something through before the election, or is it going to be a lame duck kind of thing where they try and take care of it in December, either with or without knowing, that the Senate may flip? The drama is there. There's no way to depoliticize it. In a long-term way, depoliticization of the court has to come with Congress picking up more of their responsibilities, because Congress has been unable to solve a lot of our problems. More and more things wind up in the courts. And if they're in the courts, it's always going to come down to 5-4 decisions or maybe 6-3, but that's going to be political. And the only way we can depoliticize it is to have the political branches, Congress and the president, especially Congress, pick up more of the load. And the president can push in that direction. It's Congress themselves that are going to have to make the ultimate decisions on that.
So, speaking of the court, almost every president in recent history has had the opportunity to appoint at least one justice to the Supreme Court. Are there any litmus tests that you would impose in screening judges for the court?
Well, you have to have somebody who is respected by other judges. And I think that's an area where President Trump announced a list that he was given, that people that aligned with his opinions more, but everybody was able to look at that list, and obviously no president ever has personal knowledge with every possible candidate. But I think that's one area where Trump has gone about it correctly. He asked for a list. He got a list. He publicized it. And now he's been drawing from that list.
What was the general impression that you got while watching the debate last night?
Well, that was not a debate. A debate is where substantive questions are asked and substantive answers are given, and you can't do that in a climate where people are interrupting and talking on top of each other. There has to be a certain level of decorum to have a debate, and it didn't show up last night.
So, based on what you saw last night, if you had an opportunity to sit down with Donald Trump and Joe Biden, what advice would you give them?
Well, one of the things we learned last night is that it's useless trying to sit down with Donald Trump and tell him anything. He doesn't listen. And Biden, maybe. He's so set at this point in the campaign uh, what his advisors have told him, and the focus groups and those kinds of things. And the loudest voice in the Democratic Party that he's not listening to are the Democrats for Life. And they are doing every possible thing to get him to listen to the fact that there are 21 million pro life Democrats that are being ignored. So if he's not listening to them, I don't have a lot of hope that he would listen to me.
One of the claims that Joe Biden made last night was that he would be able to unify Democrats and Republicans. Why do you believe that you are the best candidate to unify the country?
At the moment, I don't think any Democrat or any Republican can unify our country because they are so set against each other. It's going to have to be somebody from outside of those two parties that can come in and find people in the parties who are willing to work. For example, in the House of Representatives, we have a climate solutions caucus where you only get in two by two, one Republican, one Democrat. And we also have a problem solvers caucus that is also bipartisan. I would draw my cabinet members heavily out of those two caucuses, and there's similar caucuses in the Senate, and send the message that we're not going to be partisan anymore. We are going to work across the aisle, and if people want to be part of the action, they need to get with it and join us working across the aisle. There's no other hope for our country.
One major point of disagreement between Biden and Trump last night was on the integrity of the election. Should voters be concerned about the integrity of the election, or can we be confident that the results and process can be trusted?
We always want to be improving the integrity of our election. In a failed world, there will always be people who could point at something that they thought was fishy. And the rumor mills are full of that kind of stuff. But we have to have faith in our elections, or our elections are useless. Once we have destroyed faith in elections, why bother having them anymore? We just become a dictatorship. And so we work to improve our elections. We work to make them more honest. We prosecute crimes when we see it, but we also accept the results and we move forward. I think one of the finest things that Richard Nixon ever did, he probably had won that election against John F. Kennedy. There was uh, likely some fraud in Chicago, which is a Democratic stronghold. There was likely some fraud in Texas, which was Lyndon Johnson's home state. But Nixon understood that if he challenged the election and created a lot of hubbub, it was going to open us up to attacks from Soviet Union. And he, as a patriot, as a statesman, said, I'm not going to push this. Others have done the same thing. Al Gore in 2000, Hillary Clinton in 2016. Go back in history, Samuel Tilden in 1876. And so we have to say we've done the best we can with this election. If there are lawsuits, we take them to their legal conclusion, but we certainly don't use it as an excuse to rile up people in the streets and have violence.
And last night, when you were sharing your reactions to the debate on Facebook, you wrote, I would not have allowed tonight's debate to happen in a junior high classroom. We must figure out how to bring back a more respectful discourse, and that begins by those at the top setting an example. Do you believe that Donald Trump's brash and boorish style of communication is here to stay in American politics, or do you think it will leave the office when he does?
Well, I can hope it does. And the Democrats are not innocent. They say some foolish things too. Uh, but certainly, we want to work towards uh, improving our level of discourse. We want to start at the top. Any teacher knows that you model the behavior that you want the students to follow, and then you verbally correct them when they get away from it, and you keep moving forward and towards your goal, which is a classroom that runs smoothly and people can respect each other even when they disagree.
Both the Trump administration and the Biden campaign have made it evident how important the presidential cabinet is. Have you given thought to who you would want in your cabinet?
I've already mentioned the two caucuses in the House, the Problem Solvers Caucus and the Climate Solutions Caucus. Uh, every member of those two caucuses has demonstrated that they are willing to work across the aisles. And so that's one place that I would absolutely start, uh, looking from that group, and not just for its own members, but asking members of that group for recommendations. Um, I would look to pro-life Democrats uh, for their advice, their nominations. Um, I would look to the Republicans who have publicly broken with Trump, and pull in names. I would appoint my transition organization from the ranks of those same people. You know, we're a small party. There's no way that we can uh, fill a cabinet from our own members, which means it has to be a bipartisan cabinet. And in a bipartisan cabinet, I am going to be looking for people who have demonstrated that they can reach across the aisle and work with the other party. Um, that's the only way we can have an effective government. And hopefully, if we start that way, maybe we can start to lower the tension and division within the rest of Congress. Maybe some other people will get the idea that we're going to reward bipartisanship.
So, one thing that's come up repeatedly throughout this conversation is Congress and the role of Congress and how ineffective Congress is at fulfilling its role. Both Donald Trump and Barack Obama relied heavily on executive orders to implement policy. What are your thoughts on the role of executive orders, and how would you pressure Congress into doing the legislative and representative work that they were sent to Washington to do?
Well, there's always going to be a tug of war between Congress and the president. Every president is going to get frustrated uh, over things that Congress doesn't do, and he's going to be tempted to use the executive orders. And I don't think I would be any different from presidents in that situation. You want to use it as little as possible. Um, and it is a way of pressuring Congress. Uh, but I think I've already talked about how, in trying to get uh, people who have already demonstrated an ability to work across the aisle. And, you know, there's a lot of groups in the United States that are supportive of that idea. If you look at groups like the AND campaign, uh, No Labels, um, you know, there's a bunch of organizations that I think Common Good, you know, these are all groups that have this, they've identified the problem, same problem in everybody's mind. They've identified a good batch of solutions. And so we need to just turn the power of that uh, on Congress, step up the pressure, and see if we can't get some changes.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, due to the moneyed interest that you mentioned earlier with corporate personhood, I think that will be very challenging to push through because there are some interests that goes directly against their bottom line.
If you go back and look at the history of corporate personhood, it goes back to some very corrupt politicians in the years just after the Civil War. That one of them was Roscoe Conkling, who was in the Senate and wrote the 14th Amendment, or had a hand in writing it, and he intentionally used the wrong term. That was the idea was natural persons. The idea was to protect the former slaves, and he left the word natural out on purpose. But he was on the railroad payroll, and and everything since then has been based on some really sloppy work in the Supreme Court, and somehow we have to go back and correct that. And it may take a constitutional amendment, but we have to do it. Otherwise, we are never going to gain, the people are never going to gain control of our government again.
If anyone is listening to this who has decided that they can't support either major party after watching the debate last night and is looking at other options, why should they vote for you over some of the other third-party candidates that are running?
I think the number one reason that voters should look to us is that we have the best platform, the most carefully thought out and generous platform in the United States. We have the best of what other parties have to offer. For example, when the Greens look at environmental issues, we have the same or better on the environment. When you think of parties that preach individualism, well, individualism has got us where we are now. We have a president who is kind of the ultimate individualist, and it's not working. We have to work as a community. We have to work as families and small businesses and community organizations like PTAs and churches. We have to work together, and that's what our platform offers. And so when people are looking for a different party, they've already rejected the portions of the Democratic and Republican policies that are in some of our other parties that are out there.
Before we conclude, I'd like to give you an opportunity to speak directly to the voters. Feel free to share anything you think they should know or consider going into Election Day.
Well, this is part of a building thing. I don't believe we are going to take over the country this year, but we are building and we are working a long-term strategy. And to accomplish that, we need people to take a notice of us and say, hey, those guys have some really good solutions. I am well aware that I'm not the most impressive candidate that ever ran for president, but I do believe that I am running on the best party platform in America. And I would like people to take a look at that platform. And then if they agree with it, as I think many of them will, I would like for them to support us.
All right. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you, Bill.
If you enjoyed today's episode and would like to see how Brian conducts himself during a debate, he will be in Denver, Colorado for the Free and Equal Elections Open Presidential Debate on Thursday, October 8th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time, which can be live streamed at freeandequal.org. Thanks for listening. Please share this podcast with your friends and family, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so that you never miss an episode. Our next regularly scheduled episode will be released on October 12th. Tune in to hear my conversation with Kelsey Hazard, the president and founder of Secular Pro-Life.